Welcome to another episode of Prime and Load. Rifles and the men who carried them are a staple of American popular history. Their uniquely American weapons and unmatched skill are often cited for driving the British Army out of North America and single-handedly securing American independence. But how much of this is history and how much is national lore? On today's episode, we're joined by our good friend, Dr. John Bradstreet Weaver, to talk about the history of rifles, how they were reinvented for North America, and the men who carried them in battle. My name is Lee Gugino. I'm joined by Drs. Alex Burns and Andrew Bamford. Thank you for joining us for Rifles, Riflemen, and Early American Identity. Today, we're going to be talking about rifles. And Jack, you know a few things about rifles from what I understand.
That's right, Lee. I wrote my dissertation on rifles and riflemen in colonial and revolutionary America.
Awesome. And if we're just going to jump right in, can you, I think, answer probably the most basic question we could come up with? What is a rifle?
It's a good question, and there's a lot of people in the 21st century who, looking at 18th century firearms, don't really understand the distinction, so it's important to start with that. So a rifle is a gun that has a rifled barrel. That is a series of spiral grooves carved onto the inside of the barrel that imparts spin on the projectile when it's fired, and that allows it to fly further and more accurately. And that's the real difference from other weapons that are all flintlocks, that are all pretty much muzzle loading, except for some small numbers of experimental pieces and some hunting guns that only a few very wealthy aristocrats own. The real difference is in the barrel. In fact, earlier in the 18th century, most of the time they don't call rifles rifles, they call them rifle barrel pieces.
And this is different than the run-of-the-mill, probably more common firearm at the time. Common guns just have a straight, smooth barrel, correct?
Yes, that's right. Both the average soldier's musket and the less expensive fowling pieces, essentially hunting shotguns of the 18th century, both have smoothbore barrels.
And Jack, can you tell us a little bit about like the accessories of the weapon? Is like the ignition system the same on the rifle? Can it take a bayonet like a musket can?
So the rifle, the ignition system is the same. It's still a flintlock. Earlier rifles from the 16th and 17th centuries tended to use more advanced ignition systems than the matchlock. They tended to be either wheel lock or early flintlocks. But the 18th century rifle is a flintlock like almost all other 18th century guns. And then as far as whether or not they take a bayonet, in the early part of the 18th century, pretty much all rifles are hunting guns for aristocrats, and so they're not built to accommodate a bayonet. In the later part of the 18th century, where more armies are using more riflemen, some armies start to develop rifles that attach a bayonet because they understand that's one of the weaknesses of the rifle, and we'll talk about that a little bit later.
So when and who is figuring out this? I mean, today it seems like a pretty obvious concept of spinning a projectile makes it more accurate. Who's developing this at this time period?
Sure. So rifles are far older than the time period of this podcast. They developed sometime in the late Middle Ages in Alpine Europe. So they're the first references we kind of have to rifles are in northern Italy, Switzerland, Austria, and southern Germany. The earliest reference I have found to a true rifle, something with spiral grooves down the barrel, because there's some medieval guns that have straight grooves down the barrel. But spiral grooves is in an armory in the city of Turin in Italy in 1475. An inventory describes I have a quote here, Sclopetus unus feri factus lumage, a rifle with a spiral grooved barrel. Or a firearm with a spiral grooved barrel. So that's the earliest we can for sure date a rifled firearm. If there's one there in 1475, there probably are some floating around a little bit earlier. But rifles don't become widespread really until the 16th and 17th centuries, and then they're not widespread in militaries until the late 18th century, and it's only in about the 1850s where in a typical Western army, every soldier is armed with a rifle.
You said that that reference or that quote you just read, that was from Italy in the 1400s. That's too early for a flintlock, if I'm not mistaken. Can you describe that gun a little bit more, or what that gun might have been or looked like?
It might have been a very, very primitive matchlock. It's quite possible it was also just a tube on the end of a stick, which some of those very early firearms were.
It seems like a really wild mix of primitive yet some pretty advanced technology, for at least for that era.
Absolutely, yeah.
So you're saying rifles aren't common until the 1500s? After they're introduced, what context are they being used in?
They're really hunting guns for the aristocracy. It's much easier to kill a deer or a boar or another piece of large game at longer distance with a rifled gun than with a smoothbore gun. Smoothbore guns are still used in hunting, primarily for hunting birds. That's why in English they're called fowling pieces. But it's not a soldier's weapon for the most part. There are, and I think Alex can speak to this a bit, there are some experiments with rifled firearms in the earlier 17th century for soldiers, and sort of getting into the sort of post 30 Years War era. There are soldiers. Armies start to create very small numbers of men. Like, for example, French dragoons in the late 17th century will carry rifled firearms sometimes. But it's only kind of in the late 17th century that there are specific rifle units in regular armies for the most part.
And so that's also kind of the time that we see people coming over to North America. The rifle comes with them, correct?
Absolutely. The earliest evidence I've seen for a rifle in North America is actually archaeological evidence in a site near Newport News, Virginia, which is on the James River. It's a little bit east of Jamestown, this first permanent English colony in North America. In a site that predates 1640, archaeologists pulled a rifled barrel out of the ground. So rifles have been in North America almost as long as colonists have been in North America. It's possible that there were rifles in the Spanish Empire somewhere. I have not found evidence for it, and what research I did turned up relatively little evidence for rifled firearms being popular even in European Spanish possessions, or at least in Iberia. So it's possible. I would love to see a historian of colonial Latin America prove me wrong and find even earlier evidence for rifles in North America. But as of right now, Europeans started to bring them over at least in the early 17th century. Now, they were not making them in North America in the early 17th century. These were European weapons that were being brought over by colonists or being sent over by the people running the colonies, whether that's a joint stock company like the Virginia Company or the crowns of European empires like the King of France sending weapons with soldiers to serve in his North American possessions. Rifles were not made in North America really until the sort of 1720s and later.
And so, Jack, when like you go to a historic site or like you listen to a reenactor talk about a rifle or you watch like a popular documentary, you frequently hear the claim that rifles are like emblematic of two parts of American civilization, that they're something that happens on the frontier and they're associated with Germans. Are either of those true? I mean, are those factual statements that we're hearing about the rifle?
They're not entirely wrong. But the saying that without any nuance does miss some of the big picture. So the first people to make rifles in North America, in British colonies, were colonists from German Central Europe, from specifically the German part of Switzerland. The first gunsmith in Pennsylvania that we know a whole lot about was a man named Martin Milan, who was actually a Mennonite pastor who moved with his community to southeastern Pennsylvania near the city of Lancaster. And in 1719, he opened a boring mill for boring out barrels in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. His house actually still stands. It's a historic site that you can visit. So Milan's the first. No rifles attributed to him do survive. One smoothbore gun that may have been rifled at some point, because old rifles where the rifling is actually worn away were sometimes rebored into smoothbores. So there may be one firearm attributed to him survives. But the earliest rifles being made in North America look like German Jaeger rifles from the same period. If you look at a lot of the collectors and antiquarian literature around kind of the art history of the American long rifle, they often have a chapter at the beginning that says, with beautiful pictures of rifles that say these could be German rifles, these could be American rifles. They're early enough that the artistic style hasn't really diverged. American rifles don't start to become really distinct until the 1750s and 60s, and they become particularly distinct in the 1780s. Now, so the Germans, there are plenty of Germans that are making rifles. It's in kind of the part of Pennsylvania where there's lots of German-speaking settlers, Lancaster County, Berks County, where a lot of these rifle makers are operating. But there's other rifle makers as well. At the time of the American Revolution, one rifleman who served was a man named John Joseph Henry, whose family was Scots-Irish, and the Henry family go on to become important players in the American gun-making business. So it's not just Germans. The earliest printed reference I've found to rifles in Pennsylvania was a man advertising for a runaway indentured servant, who both the man who's advertising for the servant and the servant who ran were both from Wales, or had Welsh names at least. And so there's maybe an ethnic connotation with rifle making, but people of all backgrounds in British North America were using rifles, both colonists and Native Americans as well. Native Americans pretty early on do recognize the usefulness in rifles. And so groups that have contact with the part of British North America where rifles were being made, most particular the people called the Delaware or the Lenni Lenape, they are also using rifles as well.
So, Jack, you said a few minutes ago that there was a period of divergence between European and American rifles in the 1750s and 60s, and then again in the 1780s. Can you describe that a little bit more fully? Can you talk about like physically how these rifles are changing as we move through that 50-year period after 1740 in North America?
Absolutely. So the biggest difference between American and European rifles in the 18th century is actually in the name we've given them, and that is the American long rifle. European rifles tend to be short. If you can go to museums in Germany and the UK and elsewhere and see 18th century rifles that have a barrel that might be 28 inches or less. There's one rifle in the Museum of Hunting and Fishing in Munich that has a barrel, I think, that looked to be about a foot long when I visited it some years ago. Whereas American rifles start to have longer barrels in the 1750s and 60s. Short barrels stick around for a while. I found a man lost his rifle and advertised looking for it in the Pennsylvania Gazette in the 1760s, and he said it has a 2-foot barrel and it was made in Germany. So even as people are making rifles in North America, completed guns and gun parts were actually being imported particularly through Philadelphia, and Philadelphia merchants advertise selling rifles and fowling pieces and muskets, and parts to build rifles and fowling pieces and muskets. So rifles are part of international commerce in the 18th century as well. They're not just something that a gunsmith on the Pennsylvania frontier is slowly building from iron ore and a tree he cut down from his property. They're assembled sometimes from pre-built parts. So American rifles, first they get longer, then they get slimmer. European rifles are rather stoutly built. They have very thick stocks. That's the wooden part of the gun. They have very thick stocks. They have very thick barrels of a very large bore. American rifles become more delicately built. The stocks are thinner. The locks are smaller. The caliber is smaller. And so they become longer and more delicately built throughout the 18th century. And then in the 1780s, what the really big difference is that there's a profusion of regional styles, often sort of based on the county, particularly in Pennsylvania where they made. You know, a Berks County rifle is different from a Bedford County rifle. And the art on them, the carving, any inlays, any engraving on the metal becomes much more elaborate starting in the 1780s. And particularly there's a lot of sort of early American patriotic motifs in that art. Oftentimes, for example, a federal eagle with a shield engraved on a lock plate, or stars, like the stars on the American flag, sort of inlaid or engraved. So the art gets much more elaborate, and the stocks get also even more delicately built and thinner starting in the 1780s. There are some of these extant rifles, especially from a little bit further west and a little bit later, that almost kind of look, the stock, they're built like hockey sticks almost. They're that thin, and the stock is that sort of went from straight to being that curved. Bedford County rifles are a good example of this. So, but there's lots of regional styles in the very late 18th century and the early 19th century. So there's more variation as time goes on.
If I could just leaving aside the aesthetic point for a minute, what was the advantage? I mean, a European military rifle stay short so well into the 19th century. What was the driver for making them longer in America?
That's a good question. Lots of people have tried to figure that out, and there is no clear answer. I sincerely wish I could have looked at a gunsmith's papers, and he could have written a letter that said, I'm building my rifle longer because, but there's no such documentation. There's a couple of theories. One theory is that English fowling pieces are very long, and so you have these German gunsmiths encountering a sort of British market for guns, and so there's kind of combining the aesthetic qualities of the length of the sort of English long-barreled guns with the precision of a German-built rifle. So that's one theory. You do get a more accurate firearm with a longer barrel, but up to a certain point, there's diminishing returns on weight versus accuracy. So the American long rifles get 30-some, 40-some inch barrels, but they don't get much longer than that, whereas there are fowling pieces from the 18th century that have 6-foot barrels. So with smooth bores, the longer barrel makes a bigger difference. The other theory is the quality of gunpowder that's available in North America is not as good as the sort of gunpowder being used in Europe. And so with a longer rifle, more of the powder burns when the rifle is fired, so that imparts greater force on the projectile being fired, and with lower quality powder, that's more important. But we don't precisely know. There are theories. It's something that we can much better describe the how rather than the why. Another thing, and this is one other theory, and I think this is something that puts nuance on the others. I don't think it's something that would have happened on its own, but it is easier to load a rifle while standing while you are when you have a longer gun. A shorter gun is very handy if you're trying to shoot from horseback, like many European aristocrats would be doing while they're hunting. And then they're handing their rifle off to a gun bearer to reload, so they don't really care how convenient it is to load or not. Whereas an American hunter might, especially if he's working hunting for a living, which some people did in a deerskin trade that develops in the middle of the 18th century, loading and firing on his own, it's more convenient to do that with a longer barrel because you can do that while standing more easily. But it's hard to say.
So Jack, just briefly here, this is a kind of a academic sort of question. So I don't want to take forever on this, but from the way you're describing the way these objects travel and the sort of the market that's available for them, as opposed to being like an American object that's exclusively associated with the frontier, you think it'd be fair to say that rifles are very much part of like the Atlantic world, and they sort of travel across the Atlantic world, and there's sort of like a community with them.
For sure, and information about them travels back and forth. I said that, there are merchants making gun parts. Barrels from American long rifles to American specifications were being manufactured in Germany in the 18th century. There's people making for an American market in the Atlantic world to these American sensibilities. And I do wonder, and these documents might be hard to get at, but that may be the key to figuring out why long rifles exist. If someone writing to his contact back in Germany says, hey, the Americans prefer long rifles, here's why, you need to make them like this now. But they are absolutely part of the Atlantic world. They're in many ways unique to North America, but there are many unique regional objects throughout the Atlantic world that are not isolated from the international commerce, military thought, and correspondence.
Hey everyone, Lee here for the Prime and Load team. We're passionate about exploring 18th century history and tactics and bringing those stories to you. But we need your help to grow our ranks. Please share this episode with a fellow history buff, leave a review where you can, and follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and X. Most of all, join our email list. It gets you updates and insights into what's coming. You can join by using the link in this episode's description below. Thanks for listening, and now let's get back to the episode. And you said originally, especially in Europe, these are not soldiers' guns right off the bat. Does that change North America, or does that sentiment change at all?
It changes a bit. North American garrisons, especially in the 17th century, it seems, tend to get the scraps from European armories. They tend to get the weird experimental guns or stuff that's so antiquated it's no longer being used. Like, for example, and this is not an example of the rifles, but Jamestown in the 16 teens and 20s gets shipped hundreds of mail coats and bill hooks that are still in the Tower of London. These things that are emblematic of late medieval warfare. But in French holdings, inventories of the armory in Quebec in the 1660s and 1680s described sort of numbers of rifled guns in kind of the dozens, something like 60 to 80, I think, rifled pieces in 1660. Maybe less than that, maybe about 30. I need to check back at René Chartrand's book. But so you see them, but they're not quite soldiers' weapons. They're so expensive to make that giving a whole army them would be something logistically impossible. Nobody's rich enough to do that, and since they don't accommodate a bayonet in the 18th century, they're not always militarily feasible. So they do start to become soldiers' weapons, though, and they're issued to specialist troops. They're issued to light troops in particular, sometimes light cavalry, more oftenly light infantry. It really kind of starts in German Europe, where rifles originate. The Jaegers, or that's the German word for hunter, and by the era of the 7 Years' War, there's fully incorporated and organized Jaeger groups who are soldiers who enlist as Jaegers. They're not these militarized foresters anymore. They're regular soldiers that are issued and fight with rifles. But they're used in the Petite Guerre. They're not going to stand up to a cavalry charge. They're not going to stand up to a bayonet charge. But if you detach them from the rest of the army, they make excellent sharpshooters, and you can send them to go harass the enemy and secure objectives beyond what the heavy cavalry and infantry can do.
So in North America, the later part of the 18th century, we have the American Revolution. Rifles play a significant role in that conflict, don't they?
They do, and they played a role in conflict before the American Revolution even. There were riflemen who served in the 7 Years' War. Some British light infantrymen get issued rifles, particularly in the 1758 Carillon campaign. There are people in Gage's light infantry that get issued rifles that were brought over from Europe. There are rifle-armed light infantry in the Pennsylvania and Virginia provincials in the 7 Years' War, as well as in their militias. But it's the American Revolution where the rifle really becomes this defining weapon of the American revolutionaries and in North America, and that riflemen kind of become this emblem of the new United States, and kind of they're almost a bit like kind of the ethnic soldiers of the various European armies. They're kind of America's martial race, in the same way that Scottish Highlanders are in Britain, or the Cossacks are in Russia. So they achieve a sort of notoriety and association with military service that is outsized compared to their numbers.
So not every colony has rifle armed troops. This is something unique to specific places, right?
That's right. Now, there's a perception, even at the beginning of the war, that among the British, that all the colonists have rifles. I remember reading a British newspaper from spring of 1775 that the writers were essentially panicking about this American war and how there are thousands upon thousands of American militiamen all armed with rifles that are going to shoot us to pieces once this war starts. But it doesn't turn out that way. The first riflemen that join the Continental Army in spring of 1775 are 4 companies from Pennsylvania, 2 from Maryland, and 2 from Virginia that go to join the siege of Boston in the camp at Cambridge. And so from the beginning, or at least very early on, there are riflemen. But the riflemen at first, because they have this reputation, even that early, are not treated like other soldiers. They're not made to do fatigue duty. They're not made to stand guard. And so they cause a lot of trouble. The New Englanders don't like these Pennsylvanians and Southerners. And, I realize that Pennsylvanians are not Southerners, but to an 18th century man from Massachusetts, they were. So all these Southern riflemen come up. Some of them have kind of rougher manners than some of these New Englanders are used to. Many of them, because there's much more immigration to Pennsylvania and the southern colonies in the 18th century, many more of them are born elsewhere. There's a quote I have here from a Massachusetts merchant who was writing about the soldiers he saw in the siege of Boston. And he's writing to his correspondent in Philadelphia, and he says, "We have been much plagued with the riflemen. They were too hastily enlisted. There are some who are but poor marksmen. Several have deserted and gone over to the enemy. We had 34 of them tried by a court-martial for mutiny. The officers are gentlemen, but have not a thorough command of their men. Many of them are Irish and foreigners and are shrewdly suspected of being transported convicts. I am sorry to acquaint you that the character of a rifleman is held in very little estimation here. So it's a rough start.
To say the least.
But it should also be said that the Massachusetts militia were not always ideal soldiers at the beginning of the American Revolution. Very few people in North America at all were professional soldiers before 1775. There may have been men who served in the 7 Years' War, but they had gone back to their farms and their trades once that war ended. And so the whole of America needs to learn the art of soldiering once the Revolutionary War began. So I'm going to, talk a bit about, how riflemen were not always ideal, but we should keep in mind not everyone is at certainly the beginning of the war. And their role changes over time as well.
So can you describe the forming of these rifle units? It sounds like they've got a whole cast of characters. Like, how do they find these people, and how are they being organized?
Oh, for sure. The rifle units tend to be organized at the colony and then kind of the state level because it's dependent on people in the area owning rifles. Even as the war goes on and things get more standardized, New England troops are not carrying rifles. It's always Pennsylvanians or Southerners. And so typically at the very beginning of this war, people form kind of these volunteer militia companies, typically organized by the county, Hanover County, Pennsylvania, for example. And they'd been organizing for a while, even as early as 1774, before the shooting starts. Many of these local committees that are corresponding and organizing resistance to British policy and taxation are starting to realize that armed resistance might be an option. And in the Hanover Resolves, so issued by the Committee of Hanover, Pennsylvania, which is in Lancaster County, the Hanover Township Committee issues a series of resolves saying their commitment to the ideals of liberty, to they promising that they're gonna boycott British goods. But the very last article in their resolves says that should Britain try to force unjust laws upon us by force of arms, and that's not an exact quote, our cause we leave to heaven and our rifles, end quote. That is an exact quote. So these people are thinking about rifles as a military tool even before the war, and they're printing that and publishing it. So they're organizing by county. Kind of local charismatic leaders are sort of stepping up to lead these companies. People who might have a prominent role in the community and might be officers in the colonial militia say, hey, I'm organizing a company of men to march to Boston once the war starts. And then once the Continental Army becomes properly organized in June of 1775, Congress authorizes rifle companies, forms battalions of men as riflemen. And then also many colonies, when they're organizing their continental troops, add rifle companies to each regiment. So perhaps in lieu of a grenadier company, there's a rifle company. One American writer, a man named Louis Nicola, who's a military officer, the position he holds is town major for the city of Philadelphia. And then he goes on to command the Continental Army. But when Nicola is town major in 1776, he writes a manual of arms, an instruction manual for drill for the Continental Army that people debate who was actually using it, but it's present and it's published. But not only does he publish this drill book, he writes down all of his thoughts about how the Continental Army should be organized and how it should fight. And one of the things Nicola said was every regiment, instead of a grenadier company, should have a rifle company. But it should also have a light infantry company armed with a musket and bayonet as well. And for example, in Virginia, their Continental regiments at the start of the war are organized with either one or two rifle companies. Their eastern counties have one rifle company, and their regiments raised further west have two. So it still has this frontier association, even as the war goes on. But as I said, there are problems with rifles. There are civilian guns that don't take a bayonet. They're less stoutly built than muskets, so they break more easily. And so there's these military problems with the rifle that they have to come up with solutions to. A rifle is more accurate than a musket, but that's its only advantage. It's slower to load because the ball needs to be precisely fitted to the bore in order to actually function and grip the rifling. Some riflemen for closer fighting do load with undersized ball, but then that negates the advantage of a rifle and its accuracy. Riflemen, most importantly, cannot stand up to a British bayonet charge. And as everyone sitting here knows, and I'm sure many listeners of the podcast know, British tactics in the American Revolution sort of centered on shock, on fast movement, and closing with a bayonet. And so men armed with rifles that are loading slowly, even if they're firing more accurately, cannot withstand that. At the Battle of Long Island in 1776, the Pennsylvania Battalion of Rifles, commanded by a man named Samuel Miles, found over 200 of its men cut off from the rest of the army. And the officers debated what to do. Ultimately, they decided to try and fight and break out, even though their commander actually wanted them to hide and wait for the British to pass by before they tried to reconnect with the rest of the army. But this, however, was objected to under an idea that we should be blamed for not fighting at all, and perhaps charged with cowardice, which would be worse than death itself. The third proposition was therefore adopted to try and break out, and we immediately began our march, but had not proceeded more than half a mile till we fell in with a body of 400 or 500 infantry, which we attacked without hesitation. But their superiority of numbers encouraged them to march up with their bayonets, which we could not withstand, having none ourselves. I therefore ordered the troops to push on towards our lines, and remain on the ground myself until they had all passed me. And as they march up, they're eventually surrounded and forced to surrender by British troops. So they need to adapt. The rifle on its own does not function well as a military weapon against a European enemy. The fighting on the frontier, rifles work very well because that fighting tends to be small units engaging in smaller firefights that last for a very short amount of time. So the accuracy of the rifle works great in, say, Virginian militia fighting a war party of Native American warriors from the Shawnee and Haudenosaunee nations, for example. But it doesn't work so well against a battalion of disciplined British infantry.
So you just talked all about the limitations of rifles. Obviously, these bring an added reach to commanders on the battlefield. Do these American commanders come up with any ways to kind of work within the rifle's limitations to get some sort of battlefield success out of it?
Absolutely. This is one of the tactical challenges that the Continental Army overcomes in the Revolution, is figuring out how to use riflemen well. And ultimately, what they start doing is, rather than detaching riflemen and having them serve on their own when they're fighting these European armies, is having them served in combined arms units with soldiers with muskets and bayonets. In many ways, the way the Continental Army uses combined arms with rifle and bayonet is a bit reminiscent of kind of the pike and shot era of European warfare, where the muskets and bayonet kind of take on that old-fashioned role of protecting acting as the pike in that situation, protecting the men who don't really have viability fighting in close quarters, while the men who can fire further and more accurately can inflict casualties on the people they're fighting. So they do overcome that. Riflemen do good service as light troops as well. And for example, the Battle of Saratoga, the British take very heavy casualties, and many of those casualties are inflicted by riflemen, particularly the officers at the Battle of Saratoga. Most famously, Simon Fraser is supposedly killed by the Pennsylvanian rifleman Timothy Murphy. The accounts certainly say that Fraser was killed by a rifleman. The legends associated with Timothy Murphy say that he shot Fraser from over a quarter of a mile away. We have no sources from the battle that actually say that. But, and especially since we have letters from British officers that say things like, Fraser saw the man that shot him and told me it was a rifleman. So if he could see him and identify him as a rifleman, it wasn't from that far away. But the British officer corps and the artillery suffer pretty heavy casualties at Saratoga, often from riflemen who do things like climb up into trees to get a better shot. So, riflemen were successfully used in the Revolution by the Continental Army, though their role among the regulars diminishes as the war goes on. In Baron von Steuben's Regulations for the Order and Discipline of the Troops of the United States, he doesn't mention rifles at all, and he describes the armaments that American soldiers are supposed to carry. And he says, a sword for field officers, a spontoon and a sword for company and grade officers and below, a sword, musket, and bayonet for NCOs, and a musket and bayonet for private soldiers. He doesn't mention rifles at all. And rifles were still used in the latter half of the American Revolution, and there are some independent companies later on in the war. For example, a man named Major James Parr heads a corps of riflemen that serve in General Edward Hand's Corps of Light Infantry during Sullivan's campaign against the Haudenosaunee in 1779. But that's Continental troops being deployed on the frontier, and there is this thought that riflemen were particularly good for fighting Native Americans. And in fact, the reason why there's riflemen up at Saratoga fighting Burgoyne's army there in 1777 is because men like Philip Schuyler and Israel Putnam wrote to George Washington with a lot of fear and trepidation, saying, Burgoyne has a lot of Native American allies with him. We don't know how to fight Native Americans, but riflemen do. Please send us some riflemen. And Washington did, dispatching the corps of riflemen that served under Daniel Morgan. Now, by the time Morgan joined the Northern Army at Saratoga, most of Burgoyne's indigenous allies had abandoned him. But the sentiment was there. And so in the later campaigns on the frontier, riflemen are always present because they're thought to be particularly effective at fighting Native Americans, because many of them were from the frontier and so had experience from the 7 Years' War or Dunmore's War, a smaller conflict fought in 1774 between Virginia and the Shawnee. So they're present, but in the later campaigns, for example, the Southern campaign of the American Revolution, not many of the regulars are armed with rifles. There's lots of rifles, but it's all militia using them at that point.
And so, Jack, can you guys speak to, particularly in the Southern campaigns, how important are rifle-armed militia troops to our success in the Southern campaigns? Do we have any sense of how many Southern militiamen on average are carrying? I mean, obviously you talked about a rifle culture sort of in the greater Pennsylvania area, maybe in the Valley in Virginia. Is there a rifle culture in the backcountry of South Carolina and North Carolina as well?
For sure. There's riflemen as early as the 7 Years' War. Again, there's riflemen serving in the Carolina backcountry. And many of people who had been employed as or worked as market hunters, hunting deerskin for a living in the 1760s and 70s before the war, were from the Carolinas. And so many Southern militiamen carry rifles. Precisely how many, those numbers are hard to ascertain. I mean, Alex, as another American historian, knows the great controversy that that has been in the study of early America and just how many people owned guns, and figuring out what kinds of guns they've owned has been is quite difficult. The only thing that I've really seen, and there are other similar inventories around, but the most important one is from Virginia. It records Augusta County, Virginia, and it says of the 800 civilian-owned guns in Augusta County, and it's something like, the number's like 860 or 70. Over 760 of them were rifles. I think I did the math on it. It's something like 85% of the civilian-owned guns in Augusta County, Virginia, which is in the Valley, or it's in what is today Western Virginia, but not the state of West Virginia. Was most of the civilian guns were rifles, and I think those patterns map reasonably well onto the numbers of militia further south using rifles. For example, the Battle of Kings Mountain, the overwhelming majority, if not all, of the revolutionary militia that fought at Kings Mountain against the Loyalists were armed with rifles. Many of the Loyalists at Kings Mountain were armed with rifles. So there's something both sides use. Americans on both sides, and small numbers of British light infantry get issued rifles, and Hessians bring over Jaeger corps. So there's rifles kind of everywhere in the Revolution once you get past the initial fighting in spring of 1775 in New England.
Jack, just to kind of round things out here, sometimes when I'm teaching military history and to ROTC cadets and civilian students, I think my students who are like into military technology and into like specifically the history of weaponry, think about rifles and muskets and their relationship, and they think basically a musket is like an AR-15. It's like the standard weapon of the time, but like a rifle is just like a better AR-15. It's like a superior generally. Whereas I try to convince the students that a musket is probably like an AR-15, but a rifle is maybe more like a Barrett or like a long-range anti-personnel rifle. I mean, do you think that's a good analogy? I mean, these are weapons that are very, very helpful and necessary in specific circumstances, but if every single soldier has one, you're actually maybe at a disadvantage.
That's absolutely an excellent comparison. I do think that's a much better way of thinking about the rifle in 18th century warfare than thinking it of as something that's a straight upgrade from your average soldier's weapon. It has a specialized use. It's very good at what it does, but it does still bring disadvantages that military leaders have to account for and have to find ways to mitigate using the resources at their disposal.
We've spoken a little bit. You've mentioned use of rifles by the Hessian Jaeger and their issue to sort of selected British troops. I suppose what I wanted to ask from you is, was there a deliberate attempt to counter the American rifle or the mystique of the American rifle? You talked early on about how there was this fear of a continent full of crack shots. I mean, one of the things I'm particularly thinking about was the Ferguson rifle as an innovation, and the rifle company that were using those with potentially a view to sniping at Continental officers in the same way that Continental riflemen were taking out British officers. Could you comment on the British or the British-German response to American rifles?
Absolutely. So the British had been using rifles for a couple of decades by the American Revolution, but never in large numbers, and never even in the same numbers as or in proportion, at least, as some of the German powers. The British do complete and issue what some people call the Pattern 1776 rifle, which in a lot of ways looks like a German Jaeger rifle. It's almost kind of a direct copy of some of the German Jaeger rifles that I've seen, though it has a swivel that kind of attaches the rammer to the barrel, like some cavalry carbines do, and it has a steel rammer rather than a wooden one, which most American rifles, that's one of their disadvantages. There's civilian guns with wooden rather than metal rammers. So they have this pattern 76 rifle that in various British light infantry companies, small numbers of men get issued, but they're fighting alongside guys with bayonets. And then there's this Ferguson rifle, which is this experimental rifle that not only takes a bayonet, and it's a very long bayonet, that is, it's the length of a sword, but it's built like a regular musket's bayonet. It's with that sort of triangular profile. It's flatter than a typical bayonet, but it's very long. It's not only a rifle that accommodates a bayonet, it's actually a breech loading rifle. It has a system in which the trigger guard is attached to a screw in the back of the barrel, and you can unscrew the trigger guard and insert a cartridge, screw the trigger guard back closed, and prime, and it's been loaded. So it solves both of the issues of bayonet and slower to load than an American long rifle. And a small number of men with Ferguson rifles. These are invented by an officer in the British Army named Colonel Patrick Ferguson. He leads a corps of riflemen during the Philadelphia campaign in 1777 using these rifles. They're decent troops. The problem is that the Ferguson rifle is immensely expensive and complex to manufacture. It's not something that the British Army really has the resources to issue to all of its men. And so most of the British troops that carry rifles during the American Revolution end up carrying pattern 1776 rifles. By the later part of the war, the Ferguson rifle is not really used all that often. There are versions of the Ferguson rifle that survive from the later part of the Revolution and afterwards that are probably hunting guns that belong to wealthy British noblemen or wealthy Americans. It does get the Ferguson system of breech loading is probably one of the better experimental breech loading systems that people come up with in the 18th century. But it's still expensive and complex to make, and so not very many people can afford it. So the British use of the rifle in the Revolution is present, but it's somewhat limited. The Hessian use of the rifle is still not the majority of their troops, but some of the best Hessian troops, at least certainly as regarded by British commanders, were their Jaegers. They're troops armed with rifles, acting as light infantry. And in a lot of ways, the Jaegers do kind of serve as a counter to American riflemen. Johann Ewald, in his diary of the American Revolution, talks about fighting riflemen. An officer named George Hanger, he's British, but he actually serves in the Hessian Jaeger Corps in the early part of the war before transferring to the commander of loyalists, Banastre Tarleton's American Legion, British Legion of American Loyalists. Hanger talks about in his time in the Jaegers fighting against American riflemen, and it's not one of those situations where you have these two units on opposite sides of the battlefield developing this kind of rivalry that sometimes is, played up in popular history, but they're definitely acting as a counterweight to each other. Some of the best American light troops are riflemen, and some of the best troops fighting against the United States are Hessian Jaegers.
It does seem, thinking on the later history of the British Army, that the lesson that they take out of the war is if you want good riflemen, hire Germans. I mean, that's the response again in the 1790s. We don't get a British rifle regiment composed of Britons until 1800. So you have to assume that the Hessians the Jaegers did the trick as far as the British Army was concerned.
For sure, and the green uniforms worn by early British rifle units are not exact, but they're very close to the uniforms worn by Jaegers in the same period. So they're copying not only the weaponry, but the aesthetics, the military fashion of Jaegers. The United States, I should say, does the same thing. When the U.S. Regiment of Riflemen's founded in 1807, they wore green uniforms turned up black, and they look like Jaegers. They look like the British 95th Rifles, and they become a little bit more unique with the War of 1812, wearing green and black, but also kind of green and gold or green and buff as well. So there's kind of, in the late 18th and early 19th century, a universal fashion for riflemen, in the same way that kind of like hussars from all the different European powers all kind of dress similarly. Riflemen from all the different European powers, and we can include the United States, at least the regulars in the U.S. Army, because militiamen dress in civilian clothes sometimes, or they have uniquely American uniforms. But at least among regular troops that are operating and organized in along European lines, there's kind of a rifle fashion, the same way there's kind of a hussar fashion.
And Jack, you kind of started talking about it, but the rifle's use obviously does not end with the American Revolution. How does the 18th century kind of inform the rifle's use into the late 18th, early 19th century?
So the rifle maintains, in the United States, it maintains its reputation as the weapon for people fighting Native Americans. When the Continental Army is dissolved at the end of the American Revolution and replaced by a unit called the 1st American Regiment, which is tiny, it's only a couple hundred men, they're not really effective at mounting campaigns against Native Americans, particularly a Confederacy led by the Shawnee leader Red Jacket and the Miami leader Little Turtle, Blue Jacket is the Shawnee leader. These two Native American leaders lead a coalition of indigenous nations in what is today Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, Illinois, against the United States. That's kind of being covertly supported by the British, and the British aren't doing that much to help them, but certainly they've still got a grudge from the end of the Revolution, and they don't want to see the U.S. become more powerful and threaten Canada again. So the 1st American Regiment does not have riflemen. They rely basically on militiamen from Western Pennsylvania, Western Virginia, and the new state of Kentucky to act as light infantry. But their commander, Josiah Harmer, doesn't always get along well with the Frontiersmen. That being said, Harmer does recognize the need for riflemen. He's sometimes been criticized as being too dogmatic, and someone who thinks that von Steuben wrote the Bible on 18th century warfare with his regulations, and that no one needed to come up with anything new. That's not really true. He recognized the difference in making war against Native Americans versus making war against Europeans. He just didn't have the resources even to really outfit his men to the strength it was supposed to be on paper. And so he later writes that essentially the only way to effectively make war on the frontier is have men with muskets and bayonets cooperate with riflemen. After the United States Army gets defeated a couple of times in the late 1780s and early 1790s, it's reorganized under a new commander named Anthony Wayne. And Wayne, he calls this new force the Legion of the United States, a legion being a small combined arms unit. The Legion is the whole organization, and then it's made up of several sub-legions, which each include infantry, cavalry, regular infantry, and riflemen and artillery. At first, there's supposed to be 2 rifle companies in each sub-legion, but Wayne, who in 1777 once wrote that he would rather his men have an unloaded musket and bayonet than a rifle, replaces one of the rifle companies with musket and bayonet armed light infantry. Wayne spends a couple of years, starting in 1792, training his men in a place that comes to be known as Legionville. It's on the Ohio River. It's rather close to Pittsburgh. He trains his men how to fight effectively. And they fight mock battles, and they have the riflemen actually take the part of the Native Americans in these mock battles. And some of these men get really into it and start wearing war paint and sticking feathers in their clothing, in kind of this crude imitation of indigenous material culture. And so, but organizing his mock battles that way trains both his cavalry and his musket-armed infantry and his artillery to fight Native Americans, and trains riflemen on how to be good light infantry. And so there's still this association with the frontier. In the late 18th century, the legions reorganized into the Army of the United States, which is institutionally what it still is now. And a regiment of riflemen formed. People start talking about it in 1805. It's really complete by 1807. And then in the War of 1812, there are several regiments of riflemen, and riflemen serve both regulars and militiamen fight in pretty much every campaign of the War of 1812. Later on in the 19th century, the regular army is still mostly using smoothbores, but larger numbers of them fight with rifles in the 1840s. And starting in the 1850s, smoothbores begin to be phased out and are entirely replaced by rifles. There are still U.S. troops using smoothbore weapons during the Civil War, but far by the Civil War, really, it's kind of the inverse of the 18th century situation. And, in the 1770s, most people have smoothbores and a small number have rifles. And by the 1860s, most people have rifles and a small number have smoothbores. And that small number only have smoothbores because rifles aren't available for them to use. And so it's not until the mid-19th century that we see sort of the rifle completely replace the smoothbore in terms of infantry small arms.
That's amazing, Jack. Thank you so much. Do you have any resources for anybody who's particularly interested in going into this?
There are some books on riflemen in the American Revolution that are published. They're the best I can say about them is that they're popular histories, and they're not always as rigorous scholarship as we might hope. But there are good resources on 18th century militaries generally. Anywhere you can find, if you can find a scholarly book about the British Army or the Hessians, such as Friedrich Baer's recent book on the Hessians. There's also a lot of primary sources that you can delve into as well that are available through Google Books or the Internet Archive. For example, there's something called the Documentary History of Dunmore's War, which is taken from oral accounts gathered in the early 19th century and then republished in the early 20th century. That's on the Internet Archive. Many of the papers of these leaders are on databases like Founders Online, which is word searchable. And you can, look at George Washington papers and see what he has to say about riflemen through Founders Online. And I can see Alex as well has brought up my dissertation on the computer. You can download it from WVU's research repository. My dissertation is titled Rifles and Riflemen, Material Culture, Violence, and Early American Identity, 1720 to 1820. That is available online as well.
Awesome. Thank you. We'll have a link to that in the description. Awesome. Thank you so much, Jack.
You're welcome. Thank you so much for having me.
Murmurs in the Camp is a segment of our show where we answer questions and discuss topics that you, our listeners, want to hear about. If you have a question or topic that you want to submit to Murmurs in the Camp, call or text our Murmurs in the Camp voicemail box at 716-299-8426. That's 716-299-8426.
Hi guys, this is hangerflying at yahoo.com. In battle, how did getting the second or third line into battle actually work? Would first-line battalions stay stuck into the fight until they literally ran away? Or would commanders withdraw them when they recognized the unit was no longer effective? In short, how was the battle at the actual points of contact managed?
It's a good one.
Do you mind if I go first, Andrew?
No, go for it. I've got some thoughts, but let's hear yours.
Yeah, so I would say in classic sort of dissembling historian fashion, it depends on what army and time we're talking about. There are a lot of hypothetical discussions of the management of the inner passage of lines. And when I first read this question, I was kind of tempted to say, well, if the whole first line breaks and flees, probably the second line's not going to be very effective, but there are examples of 18th century battles where that happens, right? At the Battle of Kolin, the Prussian first line kind of turns to shambles, and second line troops sort of do go in advance. By the time you get to the 1770s, we know a lot about this because theoretical discussions of it in the American Army, French, the sort of brigade level officers believe that the second line should actually not be deployed in line of battle, but instead should be deployed in battalion columns behind the first line of battle, not to go up and shock the enemy in some sort of Napoleonic fashion, but just because the shorter frontage and kind of more compact mass of, say, 8 platoons in a battalion company is a little more compact, and you can manage the passage of lines a little bit easier that way. So again, it's something they thought a lot about. It's something they tried to do. Doesn't always work. I would say, my opinion, and like most historians, I bring my own baggage and my own point of view as I examine the sources, and this is what I think because of the sources that I've read. You have quotes from folks like, I think, Baranhorst, who say basically once the shooting really starts, the mass is either going to go forward or go backward. There's not a lot of things the officers can do to exert control, which is one of the reasons officers hate these kind of roiling firefights that develop in the 18th century. They're very opposed to this. They want to have the men fire by battalion volleys, platoon volleys, so that they can control the unit and continue to move it. But I mean, if Prussian sources are to be believed, these are retrospective sources talking about things that actually happen, not prescriptive sources talking about things that officers would like to do. They say, once the battalions are engaged, we kind of have to wait and see what's going to happen. So the battalion up at the point of contact is probably not very carefully marching back in order and allowing the next battalion to come up. But if that battalion breaks, and maybe the whole line breaks and goes to the side and goes in between the intervals in the units of the second line, they could come up. It's relatively rare, I think, at least in my perspective, to see the sources describe a brigadier or major general saying, oh, that battalion has been attrited, we're going to pull them back, leave a gap in the line, and feed another battalion into it to have fresh forces. That is less common. And indeed, I think that the guys would be so horrified to see that gap exist in the line more than the fact that there's an attrited unit filling the gap. So that's how I would answer it. Andrew, what would you say different?
No, not a lot different. I mean, one of the things that struck me is that looking at some of the larger battles, particularly, it's a little bit more sophisticated than just two lines stacked up, pushing forward. I mean, certainly you get that. I've been doing some work with editorial work on a manuscript about Lafelt, where the French are attacking a fortified village, and that pretty much is throw a brigade in. Oh, they've been repulsed. Right, throw another brigade in, using, as you've said, Alex, that deployment of them in column ready to go forward. But I mean, we heard with Ewan Carmichael talking about Minden in that episode with Sporkin's division, where the first line brigade goes forward, engages, and the second line brigade actually comes up and deploys on the flank. So the two lines are actually formed into a single line. I know, Alex, you commented when we were talking about Hohenfreiberg that the Duffy map isn't as clear as some of the others can be. But I mean, if I read that right, it looks like some of the second line actually goes off on a tangent and opens up a flank in the north of the battlefield. So they're not following directly the first line in that way. At a much lower tactical level, we were talking about Culloden just now, and Burrell's regiment, of course, Wolfe's regiment, the 8th. From the second line come up and they sort of come round and extend the flank of the first line. And of course the 8th in their earlier guys, yeah.
Mm-hmm. That's regiment, yeah, indeed.
Of course, doing it well from the beginning, and actually sort of enfilade the Jacobite flank there. So yeah, I would say there's from a battalion level right up to a brigade divisional level, or equivalents thereof in if we're talking about a line terminology. I think there's a flexibility there to do more than just, oh heck, the guys in front are broken, right, push the reserves in.
I mean, I know that even modern in a modern context, passage of lines and battle handoffs are friction-filled parts of engagements anyway. And I'm assuming that this is not something that these armies would be doing without any experience. They'd be practicing these sort of maneuvers. I know you can't predict every possible scenario, but I'm sure maybe they're not calling them battle drills, but there's something I would hope at least sort of similar at this time period, right?
Yeah, I mean, the Prussian army essentially does what we would today think of as war games, right? And in description of those war games, observers who are on the field say, yeah, they're practicing the passage of lines. So I mean, again, it's probably a little easier to do when Hans next to you has his head shot off by cannonball. But yeah, I mean, it's absolutely trying to do things in practice. I do think the Prussians are kind of pioneers in this regard. By the time you get to maybe after the 7 Years' War, and to some extent even before the 7 Years' War, troops on even like in places like Austria, Russia are engaged in large scale battalion on battalion war games. Something that had happened for a long time. Maybe even back in the 17th century. In Russia, at least, on a battalion level, they're doing stuff back in the 17th century. But large scale, almost calling them operationals, maybe a bit far, but like practicing deploying an entire brigade, or practicing a brigade attacking a village, or practicing being surprised by the enemy in camp and reforming behind the camp. That's stuff that is really being done starting in the 1740s in Prussia. Not just because I think that stuff even does happen in other states and other armies, almost as like for a special event. They might do something like this, like once every 5 years. But the Prussians are doing this once or twice a year in the spring and in the autumn. So they're almost instituting like a regularity that sort of stays going forward. And I think that's an important step. Kind of to some extent like the development of standing divisions and brigades as opposed to ad hoc divisions and brigades. And once you get to the Napoleonic era, I mean, these are things that are still with us today, right? Whereas George Washington brigades and Frederick the Great's brigades are ad hoc collections of troops by and large. It is a significant difference.
That's it for this episode of Prime and Load. We hope you enjoyed it as much as we did. Don't forget to sign up for our free newsletter with a link in the description. It's the best way to stay up to date on the show, see what's coming up next, and ask us questions. You can also follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, formerly known as X. This episode was hosted by Drs. Alexander Burns and Andrew Bamford. It was produced by Lee Gugino, music by Brianna Tam, Artie Sun, and Adrian Berenegger. Prime and Load is a Historic Studios podcast.